They say a city can die in a single night, not from a storm, or an earthquake, or a plague, but from a lie whispered sweetly enough to sound like a blessing. This is the story of Troy, a city that believed a gift, ignored its own fear, and opened its gates to doom. Imagine the walls of Troy rising out of the Anatolian plain, stone stacked upon stone like the pride of generations. For 10 long years, those walls had held back the greatest coalition of Greek warriors the world had ever seen. Achilles, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, names that would echo through legend, had all hurled themselves against these ramparts and failed. Behind the battlements, Trojans had begun to hope that perhaps the gods truly favored them, that perhaps their city was destined to endure forever. But every story of greatness carries, somewhere in its shadow, the seed of its fall. And for Troy, that seed had been planted long before the first Greek ship darkened its shores. It began, they say, with a judgment and with beauty. On a lonely mountainside, a shepherd prince named Paris was asked to choose which goddess was fairest, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite. Each offered a bribe of unthinkable power, a kingdom, victory in war, wisdom beyond measure. But Aphrodite promised Paris something more dangerous than any crown, a love so unmatched that the world itself would remember her name. That name was Helen, Helen of Sparta, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, became the living spark in a powder keg of honor and vengeance. When Paris carried her away to Troy, whether by seduction, abduction, or something in between, he did not just steal a queen. He stole the pride of a king, and through him, the pride of an entire Greek world. The call to arms that followed was not just about love. It was about reputation, alliances, oaths, and the fragile balance between rival powers in the Aegean. So the Greeks came. Hundreds of ships, black against the wine-dark sea, converged on the shores of Troy. The war that followed was not a single battle, but a grinding, decade-long catastrophe. Heroes clashed, gods took sides, and the bodies of the fallen piled up on the dust between the city and the sea. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, met Achilles, Greece's deadliest champion, and both found their fates in that deadly dance of honor and rage. By the 10th year, everyone was exhausted. The Greeks were sick of the siege. Troy was sick of fear. Prophecies had been spoken, bargains struck, sacred relics stolen in the night. Every advantage had been clawed for, every hope tested. Yet still the walls of Troy stood, unbroken. And that was when the Greeks changed their strategy. They stopped trying to batter down the walls and decided instead to walk in through the front gate. One morning, the Trojans looked out and saw an impossible sight. The Greek camp was empty. The ships were gone. The beaches, once crowded with enemies, lay silent and bare. In their place stood a single colossal wooden horse, towering over the sand like some strange offering to unknown gods. What happened next might be the most famous argument in all of legend. Some Trojans saw the horse and were filled with wonder. Others were filled with dread. Among the fearful was a priest named Laocoon, a man who dared to speak the words everyone else tried to swallow. He warned his people not to trust the Greeks, not even in apparent surrender. In some tellings, he hurled a spear into the horse's flank as if to wound the lie itself, and declared, "I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." But fear alone rarely wins against hope and flattery. Soon, another figure appeared, a single Greek left behind, a man named Sinon. He claimed the Greeks had abandoned him, that he was a victim of their cruelty. He spun a story. The horse, he said, was a sacred offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. If the Trojans brought it into their city, the goddess would transfer her favor from the Greeks to Troy. If they destroyed it, they would incur divine wrath. It was perhaps the most dangerous kind of lie, one that played on piety, not greed. And then, as if the gods themselves wished to settle the debate, something terrible happened. Sea serpents rose from the waves and wrapped themselves around Laocoon and his sons. crushing the life from them in a scene so horrifying that the people of Troy could not look away. Many believed it was punishment for Laocoon's doubt, a sign that the gods favored the horse, and that Sinon spoke the truth. Fear turned to superstition. Superstition turned to consensus. The gates of Troy creaked open. With ropes and rollers, singing and shouting, the Trojans dragged the huge wooden horse off the beach and into the heart of their city. They wreathed it with garlands and scattered flowers at its feet. Bells rang, torches flared. After 10 years of terror, Troy chose celebration. That night, the city shook with joy. Wine flowed like water. Music echoed down the streets. And for the first time in a decade, the people allowed themselves to believe that the nightmare was over. Children slept without listening for distant war cries. Warriors laughed and loosened their armor. Above them all, the horse loomed silently, its wooden belly filled with a very different promise. Because hidden within that hollow monument were Greece's finest warriors, hand-picked men led, in many versions, by Odysseus himself, the mastermind behind the ruse. Hour by hour, they waited in absolute darkness, breathing the thick air of seasoned timber, listening to the muffled roar of Trojan celebration outside. Every cheer they heard was another nail in Troy's coffin. At last, as the fires burned low and the city drifted into drunken sleep, the signal came. Far off on the dark horizon, the Greek ships that had pretended to depart had turned back, their sails black against the starlight as they silently approached the shore. Inside the horse, the warriors eased open a concealed hatch. One by one, they dropped onto the stones of Troy, moving like shadows through streets they had never walked but had dreamed of for a decade. They killed the sentries, opened the gates, and lit beacons to guide their returning army. Then the real storm began. The fall of Troy was not a clean victory. It was a massacre. Greek soldiers flooded into the sleeping city, torches and blades flashing in the dark. Houses burned. Temples were violated. Sacred spaces became slaughter grounds. King Priam, old and unarmed, was cut down at the altar of Zeus. Boys were killed to prevent future vengeance. Women were dragged away as prizes of war. Among the most haunting images is that of Hector's infant son, Astyanax, hurled from the city's towering walls so that no heir of Troy's royal line would live to reclaim it. Cassandra, the prophetess who had long foretold disaster and had never been believed, was dragged from a temple, her warnings finally fulfilled in the worst possible way. By dawn, the proud city that had withstood 10 years of siege had been reduced to ash and screens. And yet, even as Troy died, its story refused to. Some survivors slipped through the cracks of destruction, most famously Aeneas, who, in Roman tradition, carried his aged father on his back and led a band of refugees toward a new destiny in Italy. In that retelling, the fall of Troy became not just an ending, but a beginning, the seed of Rome itself. For centuries, people believed Troy was only a legend, a poetic dream from Homer's Iliad, too grand and tragic to be anything but myth. But in the late 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists digging at Hisar Lake in modern Turkey uncovered layer upon layer of an ancient city, fortified, wealthy, and repeatedly destroyed. In Hittite clay tablets, scholars found references to a place called Wilus, a likely ancient Troy, and to conflicts between Western Anatolian kingdoms and Mycenaean Greeks across the sea. These records do not prove that a 10-year war for Helen was fought exactly as the poets sang it, but they strongly suggest that behind the legend lies the memory of real cities, real kings, and real wars. And so Troy lies in an unusual place, half in history, half in myth. Its fall is both an archaeological puzzle and a moral parable. Was the Trojan horse a real siege engine, a metaphor for a breached gate, or a symbol of human credulity? Did a single night of deception truly end a conflict that armies could not resolve in 10 years, or is that the storyteller's way of condensing a long, complex collapse into one unforgettable image? In the end, What matters most is not whether every detail is factual, but why this story endures. The fall of Troy warns us that strength alone cannot save a city or a civilization if its judgment fails at the crucial moment. The Trojans did not die because their walls were weak. They died because they chose to trust a pleasing story over an uncomfortable truth. We live in a world crowded with our own Trojan horses. They arrive not as wooden statues, but as ideas, technologies, and promises that seem too good to question. They appeal to our pride, our hopes, our fears of being left behind or punished by unseen powers. And like the Trojans, we are tempted to drag them straight into the center of our lives, our cities, our systems. The fall of Troy asks us to pause at the gate, to listen to the Laocoons in our midst, the voices that warn, that question, that seem inconvenient or pessimistic when everyone else is celebrating. To ask, what am I welcoming in? What am I building my trust on? Because once the gates are open and the celebration has begun, it is very hard to hear footsteps in the dark. Troy's walls are gone, but its lesson stands. A city fell in a single night, not just because of Greek cunning, but because of Trojan choice. And across 3,000 years, that choice still speaks to us. In every age, in every empire, in every quiet decision where we decide to believe the gift at our door or to fear it, even when it comes dressed as a blessing.